Tonight on Metal Mayhem ROC, we continue our series, The History of Metal. We're highlighting the year 1984. Underground metal is exploding with Metallica, Slayer, SAVATAGE, and MERCYFUL FATE. The big guns get bigger. Judas Priest, IRON Maiden, Scorpions, and Van Halen, all with career albums. All that and more, Metal Mayhem ROC, next.
WLFE DB Radio.
Are you ready?
Live from the Metal Mayhem Studios in Rochester, New York.
We are gold. We are gold.
And heard around the world by metalheads just like you. This is Metal Mayhem ROC.
Heavy metal music.
Your weekly dose of metal music, interviews, album reviews, news, and more. Want to be part of the show? Send us a message through our website, metalmayhemroc.com, or hit us up on Facebook and Twitter. Search Metal Mayhem ROC.
It's getting nice and heavy.
And now, welcome tonight's host, John the Vernomatic Verno.
Good evening, everybody. It's Thursday night, and it's time for a brand new episode. As always, visit the metalmayhemroc.com website. There you'll find direct Spotify links, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. Do us a favor, download some past shows, rate and review, subscribe to the podcast. Recent episodes, we had Nigel Glockler of Saxon last week, talking about the brand new album by the band. A couple weeks ago, me and Metal Walt had a chance to talk with Tony Martin, formerly of Black Sabbath. He has a brand new solo album out, and we talked about that. And we had the history of metal, the year 1983. Those were some of the shows. Again, go back in the archives, check it out. Tonight, we're continuing that history of metal. This week, it's 1984. Besides being a fabulous Van Halen album, it was a monumental year in metal. I do have on the line Metal Walt and Ian O'Rourke. They'll be joining me in just a minute. But first, just want to remind you to sign up for our email list. This is a chance for us to stay in touch with you with weekly updates on new shows and giveaways. Quick reminder about our media partners. Monday nights, I host a live radio show on Metal Devastation Radio, 6 to 9 o'clock Eastern Time. Real good way to bring your Metal Monday in for a landing. Live chat room, requests, it's just a blast. And Mark James, friend of the show, been doing internet and broadcasting metal shows for 30 years. He has two killer shows. Friday night, Metal Mark's Vault, specializing in rare and classic metal. And Saturday nights, he has Metal Mark's Audio Aggression. Go to our website and find direct links and information on these two shows. So like I mentioned, tonight we're doing the continuing series, History of Metal, the year 1984. Let's get on my two brothers in metal. From New Jersey, Metal Walt, and from Central New York, Ian O'Rourke. Hey, Walt, how you doing, man?
I'm good, Verno. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. And my other brother, Ian, what's going on in Central New York?
Vernomatic, what's going on? Just waiting for the big snow like everybody. It's cold outside. Ready to rock, though.
It is. It's fucking February, man. What do you expect? So that's why we live in Central and Western New York, right?
Oh, my goodness.
So, all right. Well, like we always do, Walt gets things underway. Walt, get it going, man. 1984.
All right, guys, let's go. So 1984 is year 4 of the decade of heavy metal. In this particular year, you had more releases from those big bands from North America and Europe. And I think what we really saw here was that continued growth and emergence in the 80s rock, or in other words, that hair metal term that we really don't like. In that category, there's, at least 6 or more debut releases from, what would be very well-known acts. And then in the more traditional heavy metal category, where there are also a lot of other great debuts. So some of these we'll talk about in detail a little bit later, but as I've encouraged listeners to do in the past, make your own list. Take a look. There's a lot of material out there in these years that we obviously can't cover everything. Sort of on a sad note, though, 1984 was also marked or highlighted by some, pretty major incidents, and in 2 situations they were, sort of very tragic. The first being the car accident that resulted in the Def Leppard's drummer Rick Allen's arm being severed. Yet his recovery and eventual return to drumming is nothing short of a miracle. And it truthfully would alter the sound of the band go forward. It really influenced that 80s rock sound go forward. The other one was the car accident that claimed the life of Razzle of Hanoi Rocks. Vince Neil, unfortunately, of Motley Crue, was the driver behind the vehicle. They were both drunk. They were going out to get beer. They collided with another car, and Razzle was pronounced dead at the hospital. The two other people in the car were really seriously injured. In the end, Vince Neil was charged with vehicular manslaughter. It's just crazy to think that this guy's life just moved on like that. But I guess in a way, when he dedicated the Theater of Pain album to Razzle, maybe that was some sort of closure to it. And lastly, in, let's say, non-music release, the movie This Is Spinal Tap debuted, which was a satirical mockumentary about a fictional English heavy metal band. The tongue-in-cheek film really was filled with an exaggerated cliches about the typical behaviors of a rock band. And it was really met with a lot of positive reviews, despite it really only achieving modest success in the, let's say, the box office. But in a way, it was a film that provided more exposure to the heavy metal genre, and especially to the more mainstream audience, which is never a bad thing. And truthfully, in years to come, it sort of has become a cult classic. So that's our introduction to 1984. We're going to get into the honorable mentions.
Yeah, I'm going to kick this off. As many of you know, Verno has mentioned before that I am a guitar player. As a guitar player, I have been a devout Eddie Van Halen fan since I was a young lad. And a majority of my time was spent being engrossed in all of these guitar players and different bands that were coming out at the time, people that were peers with Eddie Van Halen, trying to study techniques, sounds, you name it. The first band that I want to mention is Dokken. They released their album Tooth and Nail. Tooth and Nail was a kick in the ass compared to the first album, which was still a great album in its own right. They were able to garner some success. They had the power ballad Alone Again, but they had songs like Into the Fire and Just Got Lucky that received regular rotation on both radio and MTV at the time. Yngwie Malmsteen released Rising Force that same year. And I can remember as a young boy being a subscriber to Guitar Player magazine, and they used to have these little vinyl pull-out pages that were actually a 33 RPM play sleeve. And the first song that I ever heard from Yngwie by himself was a song called Black Star. And ever since then, I was smitten with the way that this guy was able to pluck the strings on his Stratocaster. Our Canadian friends up to the north, basically kissing cousins to Rush, Triumph, released the album Thunder 7. Now, interestingly enough, this was actually a concept or a light concept based on time-related situations, changes in time travel, different things like that. They had a couple minor hits with Follow Your Heart and Spellbound that came out on the album, and it actually was pretty decent, but sadly enough was the last album that was penned by just the guys in the band. Going forward, they would have guest writers that would come in and try to help shape their sound to what was going on at the time. And the final band that I want to mention is somebody that I was introduced to by a friend of mine named James. And back in junior high school, if it was evil, James was into it. And James turned me on to the band Merciful Fate, and the album was Don't Break the Oath. And I'm going to go on record by saying that one of my favorite songs, one of my favorite riffs, still to this day of all time, it's probably on one of my top 10, top 15 lists, is the song A Dangerous Meeting, which starts off the album. The album is just a great album. There's other great songs like, The Oath and Gypsy and Come to the Sabbath that are just so powerful, and they're so different for what they're doing because they're combining a lot of different elements that were circulating and bubbling around in the metal community at the time. And the funny part about this is the same producer and the same equipment was utilized by our friends in the band Metallica at the time when they were over in Europe doing some recording. So with that being said, I'm going to kick this off to my friend Verno.
Evil James. That's one hell of a nickname. Is Evil James still evil to this day?
Evil James, the last I had known, had moved to from California. He moved from New York State to California, and then moved from California to Oregon, and was actually singing in a death metal band. So I'm thinking that Evil James is probably still a little evil.
All right. Well, props to Evil James. And I got a giggle. Walt, is that a real term? Mockumentary on that Spinal Tap? Is that for real?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that's become one of those trendy, let's say, new modern day ways of, combining two words into one. Yeah. That's a bit of a sore point for me, but that's for another discussion.
Yeah. Well, that's funny shit. So good work, guys. It's well-informed pieces. Now, we got more honorable mentions, but I got a different angle on this. I'm going to go to the old school underground kind of metal honorable mentions. I put it really together nicely, nice and tight. So in Canada, there was 3 metal bands that were breaking in '84. Exciter with their Violence and Force album. It was actually their second album, and it was the follow-up to their fantastic Heavy Metal Maniac. Great album, 3-piece, just fantastic band. Pile Drivers, a little bit of a cult band, but they have their album Metal Inquisition. It's famous with songs like Witch Hunt and Sex with Satan, and the title track Metal Inquisition with the sound effect of the guillotine, it going down. That was always a fun song. And Thrasher's Voivod came around with their album War and Pain. So after you left Canada and you came down to the States, we were all over the place. So let's go down to Texas in this band called Hellstar. James Rivera, lead singer, Hellstar from Texas, Houston area, had an album called Burning Star. And later, we're going to visit them next year with their excellent release of Remnants of War. But this band just kicked ass, just 84 power metal. Another band from Colorado was Jag Panzer, their album Ample Destruction. Now, funny thing with Jag Panzer, they released this album, and then they were dormant till 1994, and then they picked it up again in the mid-2000s. But Harry Conklin, the lead singer, he's making some waves currently as he's one of the 3 Tremors with Ripper Owens and Sean Peck. Laz Rocket, they're part of the Bay Area Big Six. Exodus, Testament, Death Angel, Forbidden, and Violence. Their album City's Gonna Burn. Now, Laz Rocket was headlining, and a young Slayer used to open up for them. Going up to Chicago, there's this band called Thrust, and they had their album Fist Held High with the song Posers Will Die. Back in the day, that was a great song, Posers Will Die. If you have a chance, go on YouTube, go on the streaming services, check it out. The Rods from Central New York, Let 'Em Eat Metal. We've chronicled the Rods, great 3-piece. And staying in Central New York, the band Manowar from Auburn, New York, has 2 albums, Hail to England and Sign of the Hammer. They had a nice 4-album run. Some EPs were big in '84. Overkill had their EP, Lizzie Borden, Give 'Em the Axe. More Canadian metal with Razor. Very rare release of Armed and Dangerous. Slayer had a couple EPs, Haunting the Chapel, and then the Live Undead. The Chicago band, doom band Trouble with their EP Assassin. That's a great, great release. If you're not into them, get into them. Trouble. Their singer, Eric Wagner, just passed away in the last 6 months. He was in a couple bands, The Skull, and a couple other side projects. Excellent singer. T.T. Quick from, I believe, Walt's area of New Jersey area had their EP, and Mark Tornello from T.T. Quick, the singer, is in Accept now. And the big boys, AC/DC, had the Jailbreak 74. A couple live albums came out. Raven, Live at the Inferno. That was from the live All for One tour. And Alcatraz with their Live Sentence. So, as I just demonstrated, there was a lot of stuff. We had the big boys doing stuff. We had the more famous honorable mentions. But a lot of these bands contributed to the history of metal. Let's send it over, back over to Walt. And Walt has some honorable mentions. What do you got, Walt?
So we haven't touched upon this in a while, but and it's been a few episodes since I've talked about the so-called Deep Purple family tree. So there's only one entry this year, and this was about Deep Purple's, let's say, reunion of sorts, right? So this was perhaps that first band of that initial heavy metal period of those gods, those first big 10 bands of the 70s to reunite. But I must say, although the expectations of the Mark II lineup were enormous, in the end, the Perfect Strangers album, to my opinion, was rather unremarkable. I mean, they put a good effort in, but there's really, it doesn't stand with the rest of them. I think actually material they would put out in their later years with Steve Morse would be much better quality. But nonetheless, the album does contain two iconic classic rock and metal tracks. That would be the title track, Perfect Strangers, and of course the song Knocking at Your Back Door, which ironically I heard on terrestrial radio about 4 hours ago out in my garage. And then sort of staying in the offshoot of the Deep Purple family tree, we're going to go over to Whitesnake and talk about their album Slide It In. This is an important one because this was the breakthrough album for them in the U.S. and would be the catalyst for their rise to stardom, which would come around 1987. This album, the last to include the original Snake logo on the cover, ironically, it delivered a harder and more commercially friendly sound, especially on that title track. And it contains really classic Whitesnake tracks, Love Ain't No Stranger and Slow and Easy. On this particular album, there were some lineup changes during the recording, but in the end, the lineup included the addition of guitarist John Sykes, who we talked about previously. And really, he brought a whole different element to both the sound and look of the band, both which would really factor in to their mid to late 80s image go forward. Okay, now on to Kiss. Sort of in 1984, I was 14 years old in 1984. And in my world, Kiss could do no wrong. And, by 84, Kiss were cool again, just in a different way. So they released the album Animalize. And, in hindsight, Animalize had all those visual elements going for it, the cool album cover, the macho look of the band members, and especially, kind of the cheesy acting they did on the Heavens on Fire video. Yet, to be honest, in my opinion, aside from the title track, most of the other kind of songs fell flat. But on a positive note, Bruce Kulick did join the band mid-tour, replacing Mark St. John, and he would become a pivotal member of that band for, let's say, the next 8 to 10 years. But, hey, listen, nonetheless, Kiss were back to being an arena-sized headlining act and had that image to go with it. They once again were on top of the world, and just because of that, they were worthy to me of an honorable mention. Quiet Riot, Condition Critical. I would say in 83, despite their unexpected rise to stardom that year, just as quickly, 1984 marked the start of their slower decline, something that I don't think was really expected that quickly. I think most bands will tell you that one of the hardest albums to make is that follow-up item to, the breakthrough album that really put him on the stardom and broke the charts. And, in my opinion, Quiet Riot fell into this trap. I mean, the effort itself on Condition Critical was positive, but it just didn't reach that commercial success despite sort of the accomplishment of the lead single, yet the second Slade cover, Mama, We're All Crazy Now. And honestly, I think the band never really got back to that big stardom ever again. So that's Quiet Riot. And then we have Bon Jovi. And let me preface this, listeners, by saying that including this in this episode, may come as a bit of a surprise to the listeners. However, their eventual massive impact on the 80s rock scene can't be denied. As a result of this, their debut self-titled album should be mentioned. Perhaps not so much for the end content, the end result, but more importantly for what would become of them and the influence that they had on that genre of music. In the end, the album did include hit songs Runaway and She Don't Know Me. And let's, give credit where credit is due. The band landed opening slots on tours from Kiss and the Scorpions. And these were big achievements for a blue-collared, middle-class type band that came out of my area of the woods, central New Jersey, that really earned their stripes the hard way. They had to dedicate their time in the clubs and grow, and that's something that definitely can't be minimized. And the last one I'm going to talk about here is SAVATAGE. The Dungeons Are Calling. And as mentioned on a prior, History of Heavy Metal episode, the tracks on this album were recorded prior, along with the material released on the debut Sirens, but they were released as a separate LP in 1984 and on a different album. To me, many of the songs from this album, such as the title track, plus By the Grace of the Witch, and my favorite, The City Beneath the Surface, are simply just heavy metal classics. They have all those elements in the songs that would eventually label the band as maybe that first in the power metal subgenre of metal. So for the listeners, if you haven't thought of this album in a while, do yourself a favor, dust this one off and crank it. You will not regret it.
Who would ever regret getting into Savatage? The Oliva brothers were fantastic. The late Chris Oliva on guitar and, the lead singer, John. I had a chance to see that band in their infancy stages, and I've been a fan since the beginning. Let's see. Yeah, Bon Jovi, you can't dispute their place in rock and roll history, but like Walt mentioned, I wasn't the biggest of fans. So I got a few more honorable mentions. Anthrax, coming up from New York, their debut album, Fistful of Metal. It's the only album with the lead singer, Neil Turbin, and original bass player Dan Lilker. Great album. The band was finally getting their segueing from those demo days into the first full length. It's unfortunate, though, that after that release, Neil Turbin left. Dan Lilker was replaced from the band with Frank Bello, the nephew of drummer Charlie Benante, but that's all been covered in other avenues. The album, to this day, they really don't play a lot of it, but it was just filled with a lot of killer stuff. The album Death Rider, or the song Death Rider, Metal Thrash and Mad. They have an Alice Cooper cover of I'm 18. That's Anthrax, Fistful of Metal. Let's see, Saxon. They came around with Crusader, their sixth album, released in September of 1984, recorded up in Atlanta, Georgia, actually, for a band from UK coming to Atlanta to record it. Not a bad album. The Crusader Prelude, a little bit of Your Fancy wasn't a bad song. Sailing to America. They do a cover of Sweet, Set Me Free. But by this time, their juices from the classic albums were running a little thin with the 3 or 4 string after Denim and Leather and Wheels of Steel. But even still, Saxon, fabulous band. Just there's a lot of good stuff in their camp. Let's see what else we have in here. Metal Church from Seattle, Washington. Great album. It's a cult classic. The original singer, David Wayne, who has since passed, Gods of Wrath, the song Metal Church. They do a cover of Deep Purple on there too with Highway Star. Another band I had a chance to see in their infant stages, and funny thing enough, in their merchandise flyer in the inner sleeve of the album, they had the Metal Church neck brace that you could purchase. So I wonder if there's any rivet heads out there that still have that Metal Church neck brace somewhere in their closet. Wasp from California, sort of shock rock. Blackie Lawless. The acronym WASP, We Are Sexual Perverts. They gained notoriety by having that song Animal Fuck Like a Beast. That was one of the first songs banned by that PMRC group that some politicians got together later in the 80s. But WASP, they joined forces with Armored Saint, who released their album March of the Saint, and they teamed up with a young Metallica for an infamous 3-band trek across America in the winter of 84-85. I have John Bush from an interview last year on Metal Mayhem ROC talking about that very tour. Let's revisit the 84-85 tour. You sort of slid in between the Metallica and the Wasp in terms of type of metal. How did you get that tour, and do you have any memory of the Buffalo, New York blizzard stop?
Were you there?
I wanted to be, but as a 15-year-old, I had tickets. My father said, "No way in hell.
You're not going."
No.
Yeah.
And
that was a classic. That was a classic show. That was a great memory of that tour. We had to stay in Buffalo for a couple days because of the blizzard. We hung out with Metallica and the guys in Wasp in the hotel for a couple days after the show because we couldn't leave town. We finally got a police escort out of town, I think, to the next town, which was maybe like Scranton, Pennsylvania. I can't remember.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there was a Super Bowl the day of the show. I think it was the Niners against the Dolphins. It's Dan Marino. So I have vivid memories of that show and that tour in particular. It was great. It was a great gig, actually. I remember it being a good show. I'm sorry that you didn't make it, but
it got worse. It got worse, John, because I'm a huge Miami Dolphin fan. So,
right.
So that day didn't turn out too well for me either.
Right, because they did lose. I do remember. I think that was Marino's only Super Bowl, if I'm not mistaken, actually. And he was an amazing quarterback.
We don't have to go there, but
Sorry.
No, it's all right.
Yeah, but great memories of that. That was a great tour. That still to this day people talk about the Metallica Wasp Armored Saint tour. It was one of those kind of infamous metal tours from the 80s, and we were very, very happy to be part of that.
Yeah, that really sucks that I couldn't get involved and go see that show. As a 15-year-old, my pops wouldn't allow me and my buddies to drive through a snowstorm and get snowed in for 3 days. Jeez, good thing I have the late pops looking out for us. But we're going to take a little break right now, and when we come back, Ian O'Rourke and Metal Walt, we're all going to explore the heavy hitters of 1984. This is the History of Metal. I'm the Vernomatic, Metal Mayhem ROC.
Metal Mayhem ROC.
Metalheads around the world know that Metal Mayhem ROC plays the music they love, gives them the music news they want, and talks with the artists they want to hear from.
We have legendary rocker Don Dock and
heavy metal comedian Jim Florence,
Michael Sweet, founder of the band Stryper,
Bobby Blitz of Overkill,
the guys from Last in Line.
We have Rod's drummer, founder, and solo artist Carl Kennedy with us, the author of the now famous Van Halen Rising, Greg Renna,
Heidi and Carla from the Butcher Babies,
Metal Mike Koscheck from the Halford Band,
Sean Peck, lead singer of Death Dealer.
Visionary. I'm a metal visionary.
Metal visionary.
Metal Mayhem ROC.
It's always good to talk metal. There's not a lot of us left.
You in? Thursday night, 8 p.m. East on all major podcast platforms.
Remember, folks, I just want to remind you about the Metal Mayhem ROC live radio show. Monday nights, Metal Devastation Radio. You can go to our website, get direct links to the show. It's a good time, man. Come out. Ian hangs out with us. We're trying to get Walt up there, but he's busy carting his kids around to hockey practice. But you rivet heads have no excuse. Get yourself up to metaldevastationradio.com and join me for some heavy metal live radio style. So right now, we're going to send it back to Walt, and he's going to introduce his heavy hitters for 1984.
Okay, so the first band I'm going to talk about is Rush, who released the album Grace Under Pressure. On this album, the band built upon its previous release signals by further emphasizing that synthesizer-based sound. And, like it or not, that style was a core part of their sound for the next 5 years or more. The change was not only evident in the songs on the album, but in the image of the band. On the 1984 tour, Geddy replaced the Rickenbacker bass that he was known for with a much smaller Steinberger bass that had that bit of a new wave look to it, which was a sign of the times. And on stage, the band members even had new hairstyles, wore Miami Vice-type colorful clothing, and Neil Peart cut off his long hair. So simply put, they adapted to all the rage of what was mainstream 84 and what the images were all about out there. On the music itself, the band intentionally decided to add some more guitar back into the song, acknowledging that the keyboards on the predecessor were a little bit too in your face. And they also added some ska and reggae elements. to the songs. And interesting enough, they called out that there were actually no acoustic guitars used at all on this album, the only one in their career. So as we all knew throughout their career, Rush loved to experiment, and on this album, it was no exception. The end result, in my opinion, is an album with mixed results. I think it's good, but it's not great. I mean, you had Distant Early Warning, which was the single and got a lot of MTV airplay and is generally a good song. But perhaps the most interesting song on the album is Red Sector A, which is a song about a fictitious prison camp, sort of evoking imagery of, let's say, concentration camps of the Holocaust. On this track, it actually is the only Rush track that never featured the bass guitar. It was actually guitars, synthesizers, and vocals only, no bass. And also worth calling out is that deep track Between the Wheels, which I believe ends the album. And this one's just a cool one because it showcases both heavy guitar riffs, which totally compete with those sort of unsettling synthesizers used up front and throughout the song. Twisted Sister released probably their biggest album of the career, Stay Hungry. As a result of the continuous airplay and video player of the two legendary songs, We're Not Gonna Take It and I Want to Rock, the album ended up selling more than 3 million copies. In a way, this album, as well as Van Halen's 1984 and maybe even Quiet Riot to a degree, were sort of the soundtracks of my life as an 8th grade kid, if I can be honest, as crazy as this seems. You know, I just recall those two singles from this album played over and over and over. You know, every kid that had a boombox in the schoolyard or the hockey cart or the ball field, those were the bands that were playing, and Twisted Sister was right up there with it. And of course, who can forget the fat kid in the videos and, you know, those classic lines, what do you want to do with your life? And I ought to have the right mind to smack your fat face. I mean, these lines that I still think are hysterical 30-something years later. And every boy that liked Twisted Sister took their pen out and had that TS logo entrenched on their notebook. But, you know, so sort of putting the hits aside, the rest of the album is really good. And it's just strong. It's got a lot of other killer tracks aside from the hits. You have Stay Hungry, Burn in Hell, and SMF. And, you know, and again, who can forget that album cover of Dee alone in full costume, sort of holding what I think is like a bloody foot and bone or something like that. So, you know, Twisted Sister, was, you know, that album that just made a giant impact in 84. Ian?
So I'm going to reiterate. I'm a guitar player. I'm a musician. I find myself always mesmerized and steeped into the creative process of other bands with great guitar players. And one of the people that I had followed for a while because of growing up as a kid in the 80s, you know, you had the advent of MTV and you had the expansion of your local FM radio. Sammy Hagar released the album VOA. Now, everybody knows this album. This album is known for its biggest hit, Sammy's biggest hit to this day, I Can't Drive 55, which story goes he was coming back from a trip from Africa. While he had been away, apparently they had changed the speed limits from 65 to 55. He was unaware of this, was coming down a back road, doing 62 in his car, got pulled over by the cops, looked at the cop and said, he goes, what did I do wrong? He said, he goes, around here we write tickets for doing 62 miles per hour. And that gave him the whole idea for the song. But I have to go back. Before I even heard that song, I had received one of the few gifts from my parents was the Footloose soundtrack on vinyl. Now, laugh all you want, but at the time, my parents were not into the heavy metal thing. They were still trying to keep me on the pop track. So one of the songs, the heaviest rockin' song on the album, is the song called The Girl Gets Around by Sammy Hagar. And it's a smoker. And it would have fit on VOA no problem, right along songs like VOA or Dick in the Dirt. You know, some of the other, singles that he had, you know, Two Sides of Love was huge at the time, had the big video on MTV along with I Can't Drive 55, and then Rock Is in My Blood. This is, if you want to hear Sammy before he went to Van Halen, this was Sammy at his pinnacle at the time. He was huge. You have to remember that. Sammy was big. He had done concerts, live concerts on MTV. He was really, really out there, and he was somebody that was kind of like a working man's, hard rock, heavy metal guy. And VOA is a great album. Another guitar-centric person who just happens to be a good friend of Sammy's from the Bay Area himself was Dave Meniketti and his band Y&T. They released the album In Rock We Trust. And I can remember specifically hearing the song Don't Stop Running and seeing that video on MTV and just loving the way that riff went. And getting into the album and, just hearing Meniketti with the solos and the sounds and everything he was doing. And then, falling in love with songs like Masters and Slaves, Lipstick and Leather. And then they had their power ballad, I Believe in You. I mean, this was a really, really great album from them. It was probably the bookmark of those, as we've mentioned before, those Ascension albums. If you go back to the Earthshaker all the way up through to this album, they're pretty consistent as far as, 80% or more of the material is just slamming great metallic tinged hard rock. These guys were really, really firing on all cylinders at the time. Another band that got a live concert that was broadcast on MTV at the time. And another band that was starting their ascension was a band called RATT, and they released Out of the Cellar. And I fell in love with the guitar playing of Warren DeMartini. He was one of those guys. He had that sound, he had that certain flair, he had that way that he looked. He was like a combination of like Joe Perry and, Keith Richards, just badass looking, slinging the guitar around and just, ripping it with these fast runs and everything that he did. This was one of the first cassettes I ever bought of my own on cassette. And along with another one that I will mention later, was probably worn out. There was a handful of them that my cousin and I would pop in and out of his boombox repeatedly, over and over again, after school, all summer long. Anytime we got the chance when we were hanging out together, all we did was bring our music together and we'd look at the magazines and we'd talk about stuff and what fictitious band we were going to create and how we were going to do things. And I mean, the album itself speaks for itself. I mean, it had killer songs and singles and videos for Round and Round, Wanted Man, Lack of Communication, Back for More. These guys knew what they were doing. They were crafting that new metal sound that they were doing at the time. And this is before everybody went full hair metal glam. These guys were just really at the top of their game. So if you get a chance, these are three albums I think that listeners out there should do themselves a favor and go back and check out.
I don't know if RATT ever, in my book, really went full glam metal. I don't know. They were never really in the Poison League. They weren't they didn't really look that glammy, I thought. They were.
Now, Reach for the Sky, kind of their music kind of shifted a little bit, and there was a little bit of a look to them. But yeah, they kind of still kept like an LA sleaze kind of thing to them. They were still pretty cool in that respect.
Big fan of Y&T, Dave Meniketti, Leonard Hayes, Joey Elves, that stuff was great. Sammy, I respect that you dig them. Not the biggest Sammy Hagar fan. And RATT, I liked RATT. RATT and roll. And you're right. I was always a big fan of Warren DeMartini. Let's see. QUEENSRCHE. 1984 saw them with their first full length. They had, international success with that EP. Just insane. And they went on tour for that album, and they ended up writing the follow-up album, The Warning, while on tour. A couple bad things happened with that album. It was inspired by the George Orwell novel 1984. The band went back over to England to record the album with the Pink Floyd producer James Guthrie. And unfortunately, during recording of the album, it went significantly over budget, somewhere to the tune of $300,000. EMI panicked. They brought in a different outside source to mix the album. The guy wasn't into rock and roll. Jeff Tate has stated that It was disgusting. They couldn't even have any input on their own release. Therefore, they were very unhappy with the mix, and the band has gone on record to say they hated it. The album had killer tracks. The title track, Warning and Force, NM 156. They had some chart success with the song Take Hold of the Flame. One of my personal favorites is the last two tracks, Child of Fire and Road to Madness. The band went on tour. They opened up for Iron Maiden, Kiss, and had a nice stint opening up for Dio over in the UK. Speaking of Iron Maiden, 1984 saw Power Slave, the band's fifth studio album. The album was based around the theme of the Egyptian theme. The album cover work is notable for that ancient theme, and they took that theme on the road for their massive stage set. It had Egyptian castles on there. At one point on either wing of the stage, they had those huge like Egyptian lion dogs or whatever those things are. Walt, you know anything about those? What are those things called? What Maiden had?
I think they were like the Sphinxes, right?
Yeah, well,
yeah.
Thank you. So the band brought this huge production on the road. The album was littered with classics. Aces High, 2 Minutes to Midnight, the 13-plus minute masterpiece, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The title track, Power Slave, speaks for itself. It was at the time, up until their latest release of Sujetsu, the only album to have a instrumental with The Duelist. So Iron Maiden, the tour went on forever. They started in Poland in August of 84 and it ended in California in July of 85. Something like, I remember opening up the album that was an end result of this tour, Live After Death. They spent 4 days at Long Beach Arena in Los Angeles and recorded all the shows, and one in the Hammersmith Odeon in London. And that in 1985, they released the live album Live After Death. And we'll cover that later on in the series. The band by the end of the tour was just immense. They were huge. They went from a cult figure band on the earlier days, and like I said, the trajectory of the career, the band was just at superstardom level. So that's Queensryche and Maiden. I'm going to send it back to Walt because he's going to explore their cousins in metal, Judas Priest.
So before I get there, a few comments, I think, about the Maiden. I think as Verno expressed, this was a big album. And they would document this tour on a live album that would be released the following year, which we'll cover in our next episode. And this is another one of those big ones that is a legendary piece of material for the metal archives. And then back to the Queensryche album, I think for me personally, I was a little bit too young to know this album. But when I discovered Queensryche in 1987 on Operation Mindcrime, and I was absolutely in love with that album, I quickly went back to the EP and this album, Rage for Order, to discover what they were all about in those formative years. And you know what? This is some really cool music, very complex, very different. And I just think it's one of those albums that you can go back and rediscover again and again and again, as old as it is. So some really good tracks on there. And something to this day that here it is 2021, 2022, Todd La Torre and the current version of Queensryche, they do pull tracks from this album and different ones in and out of the set list through the years I've seen them. So it's still something that I think for at least Michael Wilton and Eddie Jackson, this is an album that's kind of still dear to their heart. So on that note, I'm going to talk a little bit about Judas Priest, who released the album Defenders of the Faith. On this album, the band kept to that formula of sort of making those quick, up-tempo, short songs, and many of them had very catchy choruses on them. I mean, for me personally, the 4 songs on side 1 of the album, to be precise, are just totally killer. To this day, I still get pumped up, and I love headbanging to Freewheel Burning and Jawbreaker. And on the former, it's funny, I still don't know if I can figure out exactly what Rob is singing about in that sort of fast-paced midsection of the song. You kind of just go with it. But I think a lot of fans would agree on that. Rock Hard Ride Free, I love that one too. It's sort of got that anthematic feel, and it stands up on its own. And I think that side ends with the classic Judas Priest track, The Sentinel, which is another one of those songs that always Rob Halford says is another one of the characters, the scientific characters, the Sentinel of one of those, the types that are categorized in that Judas Priest sort of fantasy world. And I think we would all probably agree that's that standout track on the album. Sidekin 2 contains some of the more emotional and very atmospheric type songs. And I think one of the ones that I very much appreciated was Night Comes Down. It's got a lot of texture and it's a bit of a slower paced song, and then it builds up and, kind of see a little bit of the sound change that would come maybe in a little bit later in the 80s for Priest. But that one was a good one. And I think on that next tour in 86, they opened with that one, which was a very interesting track to open a show with. And then, of course, on the controversial side at the time, the song Eat Me Alive, despite its sexual kind of, connotations, this was one that was flagged by Tipper Gore, was considered too sexual in nature and very offensive. And it was added to that PMRC list. I think it was in the top 5 that year. And, I laugh at that now to think, you listen to how some of the other genres of music are now in this day and age of 2022 and how offensive they are, to think that a song like this was offensive. So, let it be there. And then let's not forget that album cover. It's a very colorful image that Priest was known for in the 80s. And it really depicts that sort of morphed metal head, kind of with paws of a tiger attached to tanks. And it looks like it's climbing up a hill. Just classic Priest for that era. So I know some of the listeners may debate this out there, but overall, this is a top 3 for me in the Priest catalog. So, think about it and let's see what you think about it. Be your own judge. Dio on the Last in Line. Okay. This album was the second release from the Dio band, and essentially it followed the same basic pattern as its predecessor, Holy Diver. I personally don't think there is a need to debate which one is better, as they're both equally heavy metal classics. And, pretty much by 84, the Dio band was a major draw. And as a result of this album, they quickly rose up and became sort of a global headlining act. And in their, years to come this year and their concerts through the mid to late 80s, they would really grow their stage presence on stage and have all kinds of big props, just like we talked about with the Maiden band. The songs on the album were diverse. You have We Rock and I Speed at Night. They're sort of those typical speedy, energetic songs. And then you have One Night in a City, which is sort of that pump your fist in the air song. And then you have Mystery, which, I don't personally love that song. It's almost too melodic and catchy and radio friendly. And just, I don't think that ever really fit the image of Ronnie James. And then you have the song Egypt, which is easily the most diverse and complex song, sort of that mid-tempo piece that has some ebbs and flows and has, some great visual fantasy storytelling to go along with it. So, that's the material on the album, but let's also not forget the title track, which is an epic and legendary heavy metal song in and of itself, sort of from those soft chords of Vivian Campbell introducing the song to that dramatic buildup and pause, and then just the explosiveness on the song after that. It almost reminds me of when you go up to a top of a roller coaster and there's that split-second pause where it just kind of goes silent, and then in 1 second it just drops down. To me, that's what I almost picture at that point on the song. And then, of course, there's the meaning of the song. I think this one I hold very personal. I think in a general sense, I always interpreted the lyrics as a sort of a good versus evil theme, something Ronnie would cover throughout his whole career. But to me, I always had the viewpoint that the meaning Ronnie wanted to give to the song was more of a shout out to, let's say, the outcasts or maybe the ones who don't fit in. Yet his underlying message was always to keep your head up, don't be ashamed of who you are, and never stop being yourself. And I would say to you guys, the listeners, and my co-host here, weren't we all judged and laughed at some point in our lives for liking heavy metal? I still think I'm being laughed at 51 years old. So
I've got to piggyback and just acknowledge just a little bit when it comes to. So Power Slave is my number 1 favorite Maiden album all time. Okay. I can't find a bad track on the album. I love the production. I love everything about it. It was just so powerful. And I can remember at the time when it came out, we were actually doing in English class the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And like the English teacher was doing like this extensive breakdown. And I had heard the song before I had read the book. And as we're reading the book, everything from the song is what I used to remember when we were taking quizzes. So I just thought I'd interject that one little bit of coolness there. And obviously, you know, Defenders, another great album by Priest. Last in Line, who can not love Ronnie James Dio? I mean, God rest his soul. The man's a legend. And with that, I'm going to jump on to the other band that I had segued into before when I had mentioned. This is the album Love at First Sting from the Scorpions. And as I had mentioned, when I had purchased Out of the Cellar by RATT, at or around the same time, my cousin had purchased Love at First Sting on cassette. And it all spurred off from hearing the song Rock You Like a Hurricane on MTV. And that was it. And this was another one of those albums we were enamored with, man. Bad Boys Running Wild, Big City Nights, I'm Leaving You. I mean, this was the soundtrack to my youth, you know, or at least part of it. You know, this was I always tell everybody, I go, these were the gateway bands that led to my addiction of hard rock and heavy metal. You know, I mean, there's always the older bands, but these were part of those core group of bands that kind of turned me into an addict when it comes to this kind of music. And I mean, the Scorpions still, this was, you know, at their, they were one of the ones we mentioned before. They had these great albums in the 70s and had that certain ascension. And then they ascended from the late 70s into the 80s. And they became one of the biggest bands in the world and still are to this day. I mean, people are anticipating hearing an album from this band. And there hasn't been material releasing them in how long. But just to be able to hear from a band like this that wants to put out new material, people are hungry for it because they are that good. And, we want it. You know, that's really just the way it is. I really don't have much trepidation about any of the tracks on this, and I encourage people to go back and check this out if you haven't already. With that, I'm going to send it over to my friend Verno, who's got a real good one.
Yeah, the Scorps still doing it. Priest, I love that Priest. You know, we could go on and on. But we have two big bands left for this episode. And coming in at number 2 is Metallica. 1984 saw the second album, Ride the Lightning, released. This one recorded this time around, rather in Rochester, New York. They went to Denmark, worked with producer Flemming Rasmussen. It showcased the band's musical growth. Cliff Burton, the bass player, introduced the basic music theory to the rest of the band, broadening the sound. It was just a buffet of knowledge for James Hetfield. The theory and the extended instrumentals and complex harmonies that's on the Ride the Lightning is just so much to consume. It's the last album to feature any writing contributions from former member Dave Mustaine. Contrary to reports, there's not continued influence throughout the band's early 6 or 7 year first albums or first years of existence. Kirk Hammett started to get into the rotation on this one. Some notable tidbits about this album. Ride the Lightning received positive response from music critics. Elektra Records immediately signed Metallica to a 5-year or to a multi-year deal, reissued the album of Ride the Lightning later on in their career, and it was instantly 6 times platinum. Let's see, the title track, Fight Fire, or the opening track, Fight Fire with Fire, it is the fastest Metallica song in terms of picking speed. The main riff was taped during the Kill 'Em All tour, and the acoustic intro was written by Cliff Burton, oddly enough. The title track, Ride the Lightning, Metallica's first song to touch on what they've been famous for, political content and, political overtones. Let's see. The song For Whom the Bell Tolls. Burton wrote it before he joined Metallica. It's often mistaken for an electric guitar, but again, it's actually Burton's bass augmented with distortion and a wah-wah pedal. Now, the song Fade to Black. I don't subscribe to this. I don't think it's a power ballad, but some circles say it is. Even if you were to visit their Wikipedia page, which I don't put much stock in, it calls it a power ballad. Hetfield wrote the words because he felt powerless after the band's equipment was stolen before a gig in '84 in Boston. The song Escape, originally called The Hammer, that was written as by the influence of the record label to be a radio hit. Hetfield hates the song. It was only performed once live when they did on one of the Orion Tours festival dates when they did Ride the Lightning in its entirety. Creepin' Death, the title inspired by a scene from the Ten Commandments. Kirk Hammett brought that riff from an Exodus song called Die By My Hand. And the last song, Call of Cthulhu, a fantastic instrumental. Dave Mustaine later on the Rust in Peace release rearranged part of that for this song Hangar 18. I remember getting this album when it first came out. I remember when me and my buddies were hanging out and there was a local radio show called Metallica Overdrive, and the Warhead, the legendary jock on this show, had an advanced copy, and he put it on, and it started with that guitar, the acoustic, and then it went into Fight Fire. And by the time the song ended, and then it ended with that volcanic volcanic explosion. Me and my buddies, we were just, we didn't know what we were listening to. And then it goes into Ride the Lightning and, game over. Fantastic release. The band is the biggest band in the history of heavy metal. I think they surpass every single band of heavy metal in the history of the genre. And that's why they're, probably my third favorite band. Let's see. We got one left. Ian, let's send it over to you. The boys from Pasadena. Van Halen, what do you got, buddy?
So, 1984, interestingly enough, saw the album 1984. And I can remember New Year's Eve of 1984, January 1st, they played the debut video for Jump on MTV. And I can remember staying awake to watch it. And I can remember kind of being, I guess, a little confused at first because of this large keyboard introduction. But then you see the band in this, quasi live context in a sound studio, obviously going through the motions, and there's Eddie with his guitar, and there's Roth being Roth, and Michael Anthony and Alex, and everything seems as normal. And you listen to the song, and the song is still well crafted as a very good rock song. A little more poppy than what I'm, accustomed to, but still a great song. Jump forward, couple months, and my cousin gifts it to me on vinyl. And this is one of the first few real rock or hard rock or whatever metal albums that I had on vinyl. And I wore this thing out because this album, unfortunately being the swan song for the original DLR era, was just chock full of great material. Keyboards, no keyboards, whatever, it's just, there's not a bad song on the album. And maybe it's because it's so ingrained in my brain and in my soul from listening to it frontwards and backwards and over, and actually pulling an Eddie Van Halen and putting the needle on the intro to Hot for Teacher and slowing the speed down so I could try to learn the tapping that he was doing in the beginning of the song. This is just it's what a send-off for the original Roth era to end with this album, because I can't, like I say, I can't think of a bad song on the album. I mean, even, some of the fun numbers, like Drop Dead Legs and Top Jimmy. I mean, these are great songs all the way around. And then to close it off with The House of Pain, which the riff and some of the idea actually anchors back to some of the original, sound demos that Eddie had and stuff that they had reworked and done this and that over the years. But it's just a badass way to end the album, because it's just a killer, heavy song. So anybody that has never heard this album, which I find it impossible that would be the case, you definitely need to go back and check it out, because from top to bottom, it's just another great Van Halen album, as they all are.
Yeah, 84 was cool. I remember that time, and, I have fond memories of it. My displeasure with it is the sound of the album. It's drastically different than the first 5, and I've always, in the back of my mind, just always kept that in mind. I do love, Panama. I think I associate it more with that time of my life. And, I was in 10th grade in high school, and, I went on a trip with my buddies in March of that year. We went down to Florida, and, I saw the tour like 2 weeks after or before I went on the trip. It was just the spring of Van Halen, and Roth, Eddie, Mike, Alex. It was just the original Van Halen, and it's ironic because the last song, one of the last lines, "I'm gonna pack up my bags and leave this house of pain." Coincidence or whatever. And like you said, that song, I was listening to it for years on some of those Zero demos. One of my favorite songs all time is Girl Gone Bad. I just think it's fantastic. And again, I don't say this to rub it in, but I just remember seeing that live and just watching these guys. And it was, in my eyes, I couldn't believe, maybe I was young and, you're looking at these guys in concert, but I just couldn't believe when they broke up. I'm like, well, what do you mean they broke up? They're having so much fun on stage, but that's a 16-year-old being mesmerized by, quote, rock stars and looking at the picture of what you see on stage. So, yeah, 1984, Van Halen, my favorite band. And in my eyes, they could do no wrong. So I didn't mean to shit on the album. I was just trying to, create a little yin to your yang that was my displeasure, but I love it either way. So, yeah.
If I can interject here on this album, I agree with you guys completely. As I mentioned earlier, talking about Twisted Sister, that, again, this was another one of those soundtracks of my life as an 8th grader in 1984. It was on the boom boxes and anything. But I just add a little humor in here. I think some of my heavy metal friends from my neck of the woods, we have this sort of affinity to some of the lines for Hot for Teacher that have still held up all these years later. And one of my buddies actually had a personalized T-shirt made for me that I still wear on a regular basis that just says on the front simply, "I don't feel tardy." And I think it's one of those lines that we throw out there in our own little guy speak, that it really just means nothing. If there's an awkward moment or something weird we see or something's funny, we can kind of give each other that signal and just say, "Hands up, I don't feel tardy." And I will tell you that I've played the video for my daughter Bella, who's only 7 now, and she gets a kick out of it, because I always tell her and I threaten her that I'm going to retire someday and I'm going to become a school bus driver. And that when those kids come and they're late getting on the school bus, I'm going to be that guy in the front that's going to say, "Sit down, Waldo."
It was the imagery of that. It's still, and Walt, going back on what you were saying about that priest and the PMRC and what wouldn't fly today. Well, what goes on today was nothing, or what was going on then was nothing compared to what goes on today. That video would never fly today. The dancing school teacher, half naked and everything else. So,
which by the way, I think she showed up in a recent pop artist video and playing the role of herself in the Hot for Teacher video. I can't remember what it is. You could probably find it, but it's kind of scary, and it really freaks me out a little bit that she's in her early 70s now.
Oh, God.
Wow.
Jesus.
You just made us all feel old there,
Yeah.
Walt.
So let's see. Walt, you have a preview for 1985?
Yes, of course. So 1985, a little peek into what's to come. Of course, with any particular given year in this decade of metal, there's going to be, too many new releases to count, releases from the big bands, live albums and debuts and the growth of the hair bands. And we will cover a lot of that as we do. But to give a little, let's say, teaser to about some of the other things that painted the picture of 85, there were some major personnel changes in two major bands. Let's say the heavy metal flag was flown, high and mighty and strong and proud at a very big event that took place in DC by a heavy metal icon. And then, of course, there was a major global event, one from our lifetime, that made very big news, and especially in the metal community, which was very well represented at this event. And it ended up where two original band lineups from two major acts reunited for this event. So that's a preview of 85, and there's going to be a lot more to share, and we love doing this series.
All right, well, I look forward to 85. Quickly, we're halfway through the decade. How did this happen? Shit, after you told us that the girl from the Hot for Teacher videos in her 70s, anything's possible. So, all right, Ian O'Rourke from Motorlord and Metal Walt from New Jersey, thanks for your input. We will see you next week. And you listeners, remember to visit the podchaser.com website, leave us a review, subscribe to the podcast. Join me Monday nights for the live radio show, and get yourself up to the metalmayhemroc.com website and check out some of the back episodes. Again, for Ian O'Rourke and Metal Walt, I'm the Vernomatic. This is Metal Mayhem ROC, and as always, keep it heavy.
Metal for life.
Thank you for listening to Metal Mayhem ROC. Check out our website at metalmayhemroc.com for information on podcasts, archives, links to all our live radio shows, and all sorts of info. Please like, follow, and share with everyone, even your non-metal friends. And always remember to keep it heavy.